This is the story that we know so well. This is the story that sets in train the events of the next 2 days. This is the story where it all turns, and what we learn is that, in fact, salvation history is being accomplished. We understand that this is a moment. It is not the moment. That moment will come a bit later, but without this moment, that one can't happen. Because this isn't a parlor trick. This is not, and this is, it's interesting that in the history of the church, we look back at all of the theological machinations and disputes and arguments that the church had in the first couple of hundred years of its life, thinking, how silly. Well, if they hadn't thought those things and worked it out, we couldn't think what we think and do what we need to do. So when the early church wondered, well, maybe he didn't really die. Maybe it was just he was asleep. No. You cannot be resurrected if you are not dead. If you're not dead and you appear to come back to life, you've been resuscitated. If you're not fully dead, you don't get resurrected into new life outside the old limitations. No, you are resuscitated and brought back into the limitations that you momentarily departed. He's going to die. And on this day, when we remember that story and we say the solemn collects, the inevitability of that, the inexorable forward roll of these events is frustrating. That's because we're good type A people. And our culture and everything in us says, do something. This is the reason that we live in a culture that is governed by a political system where we assume people will speak up, that they will do something. As a former cop, I can tell you that when you showed up to help at anything, whether it was a traffic accident or a murder, people were glad that you were there to do something. Those who sit in the law courts, those who make the laws, those things in our larger life that are evidence of doing something, we applaud. We think it's a good thing, and we should. Where our salvation is concerned, we hit a full stop. We hit a full stop. We have had in the last week a dreadful representation of what is going on in the story of Jesus today. A 900-foot-long ship went out of control, and there weren't brakes big enough. There weren't sea miles long enough. There was not horsepower and the good intentions and strength of a crew sufficient to stop a ship from hitting a bridge. It is that same, my God, this is happening and there's nothing I can do to stop it, quality about Good Friday. It's out of control. Absolutely beyond anything that we could do to change the outcome. I think that's the basic frustration of Good Friday for many of us. That in some way or other, basically being people of goodwill, people who are willing to participate, to take our part, to put our shoulder to the wheel in our turn and in the way that we are gifted and the way we are assigned, that we as those people can't do a thing to keep him from being executed. And not just executed, but in a particularly hideous way. That takes us into a place that puts us at a full stop. We look upon the events of this day, and finally, the only thing we can do is A, not turn away, and B, watch what happens. Most of us have been taught and have the social graces to reciprocate things, that when something good is done for us, that we reciprocate. I get invited to your house for dinner, I invite you to my house for dinner. We do that. That sort of balancing of obligations, if you will. We don't get to do that today. We don't get to do that today. If we can't stop it, at least can we do something in response that is of a like character and quality that will balance the scale? No, we can't. We get to stand with John and Jesus' mother and watch. And the prayerful prompt for this day becomes, can you simply take yes as an answer from God? Are you willing to stand still in the most squirmy-making circumstances you can imagine? The willful, state-sponsored taking of a man's life. Are you willing to stand still and watch it happen and let that be what changes you? We so often are more willing to extend a grace, to extend a permission, to extend in some way or other a goodness that we are less capable of receiving, aren't we? And that's all we get to do today. That's all. That's all we get to do today, is receive this grace. Those are the hard facts. They are not in dispute. The question becomes, what do we do with that? What do we do with that? Those of you who have seen dreadful interpersonal violence between human beings will know what I mean when I say you leave that changed. You leave it irretrievably changed. You leave it with a spiritual tattoo that shivers you and says, I tell you what, I hope I never have to see that again. That's where we are. Now, lest you think that that's bad news, lest you think that this is some sort of groupthink attempt to walk up to something really grisly and just as voyeurs look upon it, please remember that the reason he is where he is because of the way we are. And so we have a direct part in how this began. And we are invited into making choices about how this ends, at least in our lives. So I invite you. In a moment we will say the solemn collects. I will bring in a 3/4 size cross that has nails in it, and we will take some time to be quiet around that and meditate upon these things. And finally, come away with what you would not think would be your first or primary response to it. Come away grateful. Come away from the events of this day staggered by them, changed by them, repulsed by them, to be sure, and grateful. He's there because of us. He is there for us. He is there so that we don't have to be there. Blessed be God for what is happening. Have the courage to not blink, please. Have the courage to be fully present, not dispassionate, but fully engaged. And say thank you. Amen.